Magandang araw po sa kanilang lahat. Okay lang audio? You can hear me from the back. Magandang araw po sa kanilang lahat. Maraming salamat. Ako po si Robbie Alampay. I am from One News. I host a program, I co-host a program called The Chiefs. I'm also founder and chairman, executive editor of Puma Podcast. Puma Podcast. Ipa-plug ko lang, meron kaming episode with Professor Shelo Magno. On how to look on how to all be part of transparency and governance work, including looking for confidential funds. It's a wonderful episode that we had. We also had a live workshop with Professor Shelo Magno. You can look for that. Also, I'm proud to say that Puma Podcast, that's the reason why we are and proud to be an official media partner of these events at the UP School of Economics. Puma Podcast also produces the podcast of Usapang Econ ni Professor JC Punong Bayan. And so, Dean Joy Abrenica, maraming salamat. But that's a long way of saying I also did not really have a choice but to say yes to this. It's also an honor. It's also an honor to be here. I used to be editor-in-chief of Business World. That is my only qualification to stand in a room full of economists. But that qualification also comes with having worked as a member of my board, my boss before Dean Raul Fabella at the UP School of Economics. An honor to be here. My happiness to be here at the University of the Philippines, home to UAAP Season 86 champions of the UP men's basketball team. To Professor Daniel Kaufmann, whom I will introduce briefly, we're all happy to be here. Thank you very much, Senor, for coming here. As we say here in the Philippines, mabuhay. As we say here in the University of the Philippines, atin to. Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's UP School of Economics and the Philippine Center for Economic Development. I had to look it up. Philippine Center for Economic Development. I'll betray my age here. It used to be that we just called it PCED. Nobody bothered to find out what PCED is. Because of a certain generation, PCED just means inuman. That's what you now more familiarly call the University Hotel. So if you mention to anybody older than you na you're going to PCED, that betrays your age and that betrays your interests while you are in the UP School of in the University of the Philippines. It also, but I take note of that it's tama-tama lang pala na nalaman ko kung ano yung kabuuan ng PCED because we are also holding these events in time and ahead of the 50th anniversary of the Philippine Center for Economic Development. And as part of this series, we have the honor of having with us somebody to lead us on a very interesting and always timely subject for the Philippines. To tell you, let me tell you more about Professor Daniel Kaufmann. Professor Kaufmann is a senior fellow at Results for Development, that's R4D, at the Brookings Institution, as well as President Emeritus of the Natural Resources Governance Institute. He has been a visiting professor of economics at UP Diliman, so no stranger to us, always a friend, and in the past held senior positions at the World Bank, where he pioneered work on governance and anti-corruption. He was also a visiting scholar at Harvard, served in various boards on governance, anti-corruption, natural resources, including at the Extractives Industry Transparency Initiative and at high-level expert commissions such as the OECD and other international organizations. Certainly, if there is anything good that we are seeing in governance around the world, maybe he has something to do with that. Not to say that he deserves blame for everything that not necessarily goes well, but he has advised leaders who don't always listen, and leaders of states and of international as well as non-government organizations around the world. This is very, very long. I'll stop it here. Our friend and our somebody to guide us now with his expertise from Chile, traveling all the way, halfway around the world, Professor Daniel Kaufmann.
Good afternoon. It is my honor and pleasure being with you. Thanks to you, Robbie. Thanks to the moderators. Thanks to Joy, the dean, and also to somebody who was Heidi Mendoza, the eminent Heidi Mendoza is, I know, online with us today, and Dr. Raul Fabelia is with us now. It is my honor, and I'm humbled by that. Let me say up front that I want to cover quite a bit of material, but not take most of the time, because I'm even more keen about listening to the response of the discussion, and then I know it will be open to everyone in the floor. And most importantly is to listen to you in terms of whether this is relevant for the Philippines, and if so, in what manner. I do want to present quite a bit, and especially in terms of the empirical work, the data work, looking at the evidence and letting the data speak. So some of the materials, I will go through it very quickly, but with a promise. And the promise is, of course, for transparency. So anybody who is interested, then this will be available. I understand that this will be also recorded and posted online. So without further ado, let me get going with just a few pictures, because in a very brief way, I want to I want to suggest where I come from in terms of the early work on these issues. Already more than 40 years ago, even before I joined the World Bank, in fact, I started working on the issues of poverty and development. And related to my dissertation, I would go to different places. In fact, I even came here to the Philippines at the time and worked in the Tondo shanty towns at the time, and trying to understand the roots of poverty and what could be done about it. One of those places was Cartagena, Colombia, where I have this picture. This is just a few kilometers away from the most ritzy neighborhood by the water on the one hand, as you see, and on the other, the most abject poverty of people who didn't live in the land of Cartagena, but in what's called the Ciénaga, which is basically the dirty lagoon or the sewage went. So in beginning to understand, trying to understand why is that, I was a traditional economist. It didn't take rocket science to realize that the answers to this socioeconomic, major socioeconomic challenge didn't reside just in economics, but governance and corruption had something to do with it, which at the time, then I joined the World Bank, was kind of taboo at the World Bank. We couldn't even write the word corruption in the documents of the World Bank. We had to write C ... because that was not considered part of the remit of the international organization. Not long after that, I was involved in helping and working and assessing a World Bank project in Tanzania, in this remote city in the mountains of Morogoro, where World Bank helped finance the second largest factory in the world, shoe factory, what was going to be the second largest. And you see that huge building there. Well, I think at the end, a grand total of about 7 pairs of shoes were produced. And the ones I saw, and they showed me the few ones that they had produced, had nails sticking out. In other words, it was a classic case of a white elephant. Again, it didn't take too long to realize that monies had disappeared, had been siphoned off, and so on. So already, this is in the 80s. it was clear that it was a huge issue. So then I'm asked to go and open for the first time the office and the work of the World Bank in a new independent country after the Soviet Union ceases to be an union, basically, the Iron Curtain falls, and Ukraine becomes independent. And in that context, I decided to start doing first very initial data work with surveys on these issues. And we even extracted, one of the reformist ministers asked me if I can do that, a bribe fee list. How much was on average being paid to get a connection to the telephone, get away from the inspector visits, from enterprise registration, and so on. So we began to codify the issue. The issue of corruption in Russia and in Ukraine, at the time the fees were twice as much in Russia than in Ukraine, but they persisted in both places for many years. Over time in Russia it grew more, and over the past few years in Ukraine, as we will see, it has become a little bit better. But by 2015, a president had been installed as a puppet president, in fact, by the president of Russia, Putin, and that was Yanukovych, and there was basically one of the first or second already major demonstrations, it's called the Maidan, that comes up in Kiev, and he had to flee the country because of corruption, including in the elections that put him back in power. And as he fled, 10 kilometers, a few kilometers away from Kiev, a secret palace that had been built in a totally corrupt way, millions and millions of dollars, if not, was discovered. And one can see there on the right, you can see the citizens being invited to witness that corruption and that palace that basically was held there secretly. So this is to begin to suggest that this has been a global challenge and for quite a while. But one of the insights we had that it was really important to codify it, and codify it with rigorous economic and related tools in terms of data and analysis, and go beyond the photographs and the media events. So that's what I'm going to try to do in the next half an hour or so, and show a little bit of what has emerged from all this data and analysis work until today. One of the important notions that we will discuss is that to address the issue of corruption, it's very important to have the data, the analysis and so on, and the evidence, and in part the power of data is so important because it's not as simple as adopting another decree or just having another commission or another campaign against corruption. And that's why for decades I've been already suggesting that one cannot fight corruption by fighting corruption, and we'll see why during the presentation. We will put also the notion of corruption in a broader context, which is very important if one accepts the notion that one cannot just fight corruption in a simplistic way by fighting corruption. One has to see the broader context of governance. But for that, we have to understand and have some kind of consensus. What do we talk about when we talk about governance? And what are the links to corruption and the links to rule of law? How do we measure it? And once we measure it, does it matter? What is the evidence about the consequences of poor governance and corruption? And then we will address a very specific challenge in governance and related to grand corruption that with colleagues have been working on for many, many years as well, and that I believe it deserves much more attention, especially nowadays. And that's the concept of state capture, which is, we believe it's a fundamental challenge, and now we're weighing into new measures to show the extent to that exists in different countries. We will use as a case sorry, as a case study, very briefly, the problem of governance and state capture in extractive industry or natural resources, which is a big issue, and also an obstacle to the energy transition. And then we will discuss a little bit in concluding what are our insights and options for Asia and beyond. I will be showing some data about the Philippines. I'm not an expert on the Philippines, so in terms of the insights and what to do about this evidence and data, that's deferred, obviously, to you, the experts here. And I look forward very much to the discussion. Now, to start with, just very basic, very quickly, what do we talk about governance and how do we measure it? So we have measured it already for over a quarter century through the Worldwide Governance Indicators, a project that our Cray at the World Bank and myself started back then. And essentially, we see governance as a set of institutions and norms by which authority in a country is exercised. Now, that's not good enough because we need to be a bit more specific, and then we go to the specific three main clusters of governance. The political cluster of governance, the more economic cluster of governance, and then the institutional cluster of governance. And each one of them we translated into two dimensions that we measure, into two indicators. So it's 3 times 2. We then come up with 6 indicators for addressing the issue and showing the issue with measurement of governance. So the first, which is a political aspect, is a process by which those in authority are selected, are monitored, and are replaced. And that basically includes 2 very different indicators. One is about the extent of accountability and voice and democratic accountability, and the other, to what extent there is political stability and absence of major violence and terrorism. Then we move to the second, more economic dimension of governance, which is the capacity of government to formulate and implement policies and provide public services to the citizenry. And again, there are 2 functions of government which are very distinct and as important from each other. One is the effectiveness of the public sector, of the bureaucracy, of the government, of each institution there. And the second is the quality of the regulatory framework. That's a second very important function of government. Last but not least is the institutional respect dimension of governance. The respect that there is by citizens and state institutions that govern interactions among them. And again, 2 distinct, they're related, but 2 distinct indicators and variables that we measure, we construct and measure. One is the extent of the application of rule of law, not just what's in the books, which sometimes a lot of good stuff is in the books, but not necessarily applied, implemented in practice. Rule of law. And the last but not least is the extent to which there is control of corruption in the country. So basically, 2 objectives are we try to attain by having this very simple framework. One is to suggest that if one wants to address corruption, say one is interested in one of these dimensions, very concerned about controlling corruption, it's absolutely imperative to look at the other dimensions because control of corruption in many ways is a symptom of the weaknesses in other dimensions of governance. So one has to look at this broader framework of governance even if the focus is on controlling corruption. And the second is to distinguish clearly. Sometimes we equate corruption with governance. Sometimes we equate rule of law with governance. But no, they're distinct. Governance is a much broader type of notion that encompasses all these together. We then embarked at the time on a search for the best type of techniques to be able to to aggregate indicators and to measure them. And basically what we did is collect data from many, many different sources, and at the end of the day, we get basically to measure over 200 countries from 1996 until basically the present. The last measure was recently out, and it's until the end of 2022. It's a particular technique that we use to do these measures, and it's part of this significant research project that we have had for a long time with our CRE, as I've mentioned before. This is, as I promised earlier, in the area of saying, trust me. We have many, many sources. We don't come up with any data ourselves. We believe in the wall between the analysts that construct the indices, which is ourselves on the one hand, and the data itself and the judgments which are made by hundreds of thousands of respondents from surveys of citizens, surveys of firms, experts, and so on. So we have cross-country survey of firms, cross-country surveys of individuals, like the Gallups, then the expert assessments from like economic intelligence units and so on, in that case from commercial outfits, but also from NGOs and think tanks, as well from governments and multilateral organizations. This gives a list of all the 30 sources or so that we utilize to do this. And we use a particular technique which is used to aggregate, which has one important advantage, is let the data speak to come up with the scores for every country, but not only for the score, but to be able to be very transparent and precise about the extent of imprecision in the data, because we have to be careful. All these type of exercise and data comes with a margin of error, and we take that very seriously in trying to be transparent about the margin of error. Again, I'm not going to go through the more rigorous details of how do we do that, but this is a way, again, what I'm showing here of saying, trust me, and let's get very quickly into the initial into the results we get. 200 plus countries don't fit in one graph, so I fit about 70, 75. And what I want to show here is a couple of things. One is that this methodology we use comes up with a score for every country for every year. And the level of a score is the height of each column. So here, in the case of New Zealand, is where I show that height. That's New Zealand, obviously one of the top 3, top 5 countries in terms of, in this case, is control of corruption. There are also 5 other indicators, as I said. But we also show and come up with a margin of error associated with each, which is each score, which is a thin line at the top of each column. And that's what we see here. It so happens, I just chose it, that the margin of error here for the arrows, I chose it so you see where Philippines is more or less. It is not at the very bottom, but is in the bottom half in the case of these countries. Now, the bad news about showing and being very transparent and clear about margin of error is that we cannot pretend that the precise horse races can be run with this data, and that Denmark can tell New Zealand, I beat you, because all the ones in dark green on the far left, the ones that are very close to each other, you know statistics, they are in a statistical tie if one takes into account seriously that there are margins of error. The good news is that the margin of error, as you see, is not fatally large, and therefore some inferences and comparisons can be made. In this case, it's over space across countries. So the green countries are obviously different than the yellow, dark yellow, and those are different in a statistical, meaningful, significant sense than the red ones, and so on. So making inferences around 5 different groups and categories, and which one are models for the world on the one hand, or in the middle, doing so-so, and then governance crisis, the very red ones, that can be, those comparisons can be made with confidence. The same applies over time, and we'll get into that and go quickly through some of that. But before that, a different way of showing this data is through governance map. The darker it is, it means the better the governance indicator. In this case, is voice and democratic accountability. You may find it of interest that Canada and the Nordic countries, Scandinavian, are the models, the darkest. United States is no longer there. But you'll find also of interest that there is significant variation in different regions and countries in the world. In fact, if we continue moving, here, let's go to control of corruption, we see also a lot of variation and so on. And one can zoom. In fact, if this looks to you a little bit like a copy and paste from the web, it is. It's all in the web, and you can interactively ask for the indicator. You can zoom in and zoom out. There's a way. Since I come from Latin America, for a second, we can focus on Latin America. We have the tendency of generalizing about continents. But in Latin America, we have the whole spectrum between the dark. It's very small, but Uruguay is about the best. Chile is doing relatively well too. And then look how wide Venezuela is. Then we have the region here, and we see also very significant variation, although, yeah, there is. I mean, the differences between Laos and Japan, for instance, and then you see the others, and we will be discussing that further. Let's get to another way of looking at this data that may provide additional insight in terms of these governance indicators. Again, this is all directly from the web. This, I show in Latin America an emblematic case of a descent to state failure has been the case of Venezuela. The top bar for each indicator, the 6 indicators are in this graph. The top bar is the one most in the past, is the year 2000. Then it's 2012, 2017, and 2022 going down. So we see that. Now, in the past, there were many writings saying that this is all historically predetermined. There have been even genetic theories, and that culture is everything, and therefore it's very difficult for governance to change. Well, not only here it shows how much it can dramatically change over time, but for the worse. But let's look at the neighbor, and that's Colombia. This is a neighbor with exactly the same historical antecedents in terms of language, colonial past, and so on, going very much in the better and good direction. So it shows how much these can change basically over time. Then one of the best cases right now is the best case in governance in Latin America, and another improvement is Uruguay. In fact, Uruguay is now the best, have the best indicator of governance in the Americas, with the exception of Canada, is close to it, but it has surpassed the United States. And we see even the last one is control of corruption, the bottom line, and in that it has been improving, although not enormously. You see here, United States, not bad, but considering the superpower that it is, it's full, it's far from being full, and it's not moving, has not been moving in the right direction. One that is, if one asks, okay, what is a model case? Obviously, here we see what the art of the possible, but of course it's a very, very advanced economy, so we see the case of Denmark just to see what the art of the possible can show. Let's move to Asia for a second. A very good case. Obviously, Singapore has very good indicators. We're not showing them for lack of time, except for voice and accountability, where it doesn't have good ratings. Taiwan is a very interesting case, not only very highly rated, but also, as we see, moving in the right direction over time. China is different, as we see, but it's very interesting to look in a dispassionate way about China, because it has made some significant achievements on some dimensions of governance, particularly in the economic dimensions of governance, like we see there in government effectiveness, for instance, some in rule of law. Malaysia is a bit better, in not where Taiwan is, but quite a bit better. It shows also if Philippines is going to compare itself with other countries, where Philippines it could be. And here we see Philippines, and I'll let the data speak, and you may have comments on that, whether the glass is half full or half empty, and in terms of which indicators doing better or worse. It's interesting to note, the only point I like to make is that compared with its peers in Asia, Philippines has always had better voice and democratic accountability indicators, which will not surprise you. However, there are some clouds in the horizon according to the data in terms of the direction of travel. It's not moving in the right direction. Now, if we want to look very quickly across regions, even though one has to be careful, as I said, in terms of generalizing about regions, in the middle, in fact, right here, that's emerging East Asia, where Philippines is also there. And it's interesting to see over time, this is the last one, right, 2022, but over time it has basically improved much more than Latin America, which is more challenged. Each bar, each column is a different indicator in this case. So it's interesting to see how in one area, though, Latin America is above East Asia, and that's voice and democratic accountability. So that's something to keep in mind. And then Central and Eastern Europe used to be much below Latin America, but it leapfrogged over it, and now it's close to where emerging East Asia is. But every region has its component where there are some more strengths and other more weaknesses. They don't all move together. Okay, so that was a quick overview of what the data is telling us, but we cannot go very far without answering the question, does this matter? Does governance and corruption matter? And if so, how much? So let's look very simply at basically some components, some dimensions of the cost and the consequences of corruption. One of the pieces of research that we did many years ago tried to answer the question, and controlling for causality, direction, and so on. Basically, does improving governance, improving rule of law, and improving corruption lead to higher incomes for a country, specifically income per capita? And we found, on average, using different methodologies and so on, but this data set, we found what we call the 3 times development dividend for improving governance, because on average, a country that makes the effort of reforming governance, improving governance, and control of corruption by 1 standard deviation. Those who know statistics, a normal distribution is 5 standard deviations, so an improvement of 1 standard deviation is only 1/5 of the direction of the travel that is needed, so it's totally feasible, and many countries have done it. If you improve it by that, over time, in the long term, the income per capita of the country increases 3-fold, 3 times. $10,000 per capita today, $30,000 in the future, if that effort. So it matters enormously. Similar results we found in terms of reductions of infant mortality and in terms of improvements in education. Others did it also for investment, foreign direct investment, as well as domestic investment. Here we see how much also it's related to competitiveness. Countries that have poor control of corruption, poor governance, suffer enormously in terms of global competitiveness. This is using the data of the World Economic Forum. So the competitiveness loss is enormous. If the country wants to go to the market, to the international markets, and have sovereign borrowings, a country that has significant corruption and poor governance has to pay 1,000 basis points more in the international market than a country that is doing well on that. That's what we call the 1,000 basic points dividend of good governance. The difference between Chile and Egypt, it is 1,000 basis points in terms of what's needed to borrow. Chile can borrow at 200 points over LIBOR. In Egypt, this was a few years ago, would be 1,200. So it's enormous, the tax that every citizen in the country would have to pay when there is significant gross corruption. This is about the macroeconomic stability. Budget deficits are much larger in countries with higher levels of corruption. And this is only within the advanced economies of the OECD, so not even with the developing countries. So even within the advanced countries, we find a significant relationship. Let's move now to the question, okay, but what works in terms of addressing corruption? We cannot do full justice to that, but in terms of what the data shows, one absolutely obvious determinant, and we already alluded to that, is the extent to which the country enjoys basic freedoms, enjoys voice and democratic accountability, as we see here, a free press and different freedom rights, including rights of women, is absolutely correlated, linked to addressing corruption and to improve governance. There are other factors. I'll conclude with that very, very briefly, but it was just to show how important this is. Transparency is also obviously related to that, and that relates to press freedom. One emblematic case, sector, that was so important to address the issues of governance because it has been overall, with some exceptions, there's been overall poor governance is in natural resources, and particularly in natural resources, resource-rich countries or countries that discover and are exploiting more recently those resources. It's a major challenge. It has been called the resource curse. However, we have to be careful with this issue of the resource curse because it's not predetermined that the country that is rich in natural resources will end up managing them poorly and doing worse. It so happens that the majority have not handled it well. But there are countries, including the country I come from, Chile, but they are obviously the cases of Norway and Botswana. So in every region, there are good examples that show, yes, it can be done. But it's a huge issue that deserves enormous attention. In some sense, it's one of the major challenges of this decade, this generation, and the next, for a variety of reasons. But we see some of that here. Resource-rich countries overall have much lower levels of governance and also control of corruption than those that are richer. Those are not resource rich, and we see it here. Not only that, but the direction of travel has been slightly in the good direction if you are not rich in resources, and yet in the opposite direction, as we see here, for countries that are resource rich. So, yes, there is a problem. There is a serious problem, and if these countries that are resource rich, we have done basic simulations, do not improve the governance levels stay the way they are today, which overall they are relatively low, by 2030, over 80% of the poor of the world are going to be in resource-rich countries, even though resource-rich countries only account for 1/3 of the population of the world. So it's just to show the magnitude of the challenge in this area and why focus on resources is needed. On the upside, to see the opportunity, the possibility, we go back to the 3 times dividend graph that I showed before and the finding. And in fact, we find that if the country, which is resource rich, is combined with major improvement in governance, the payoff of that is more than 3 times, it's 4 times. So the payoff, if you combine, okay, new resources of the countries is now exploiting some of these resources better and better managed, you can go to a totally different level. In terms of international initiatives to address these, let me just mention quickly one of them, because as mentioned before, some of us have been associated with that, including Cielo Magno. We were together in the board of EITI for a long time. It's one such initiative. The focus there is in that combination, that marriage between transparency, accountability, and participation that can be very effective if it is implemented, if transparency is real, and if accountability and participation is serious and real. The last segment of my remarks will refer to what I suggested before, this very particular challenge of state capture. So what do we talk about when we talk about state capture? Which is work that, again, I started almost 25 years ago with my colleague Joel Hellman, who now heads the School of International Affairs at Georgetown University. So essentially, we are very dissatisfied with the traditional approaches and notions of corruption, which focus very much on administrative, bureaucratic corruption, and essentially focus on the bureaucrats receiving bribes and what kind of bribes was receiving, which is very much what was happening in getting around the rules of the game. When the rules of the game were being implemented, some of the laws that exist, how do we get around and we get a favorable judicial decision? So that was a traditional notion of corruption, which were much easier to measure in some sense. Instead, what basically we propose is something much more pernicious, we believed, which is that there could be very high-level corruption that shapes the rules of the game, not that just gets around the rules of the game, but the shapers of, essentially, the laws, the regulations, the policies, and the key institutions of the state, where non-state actors, or very powerful, colluding in many cases with state actors, we were shaping the rules of the game for their own private benefit at the expense of the public good. That's what we call state capture. It's capture of the state, institutions, policy, and so on, by those particularly powerful individuals. So instead of so much focus on a corrupt public servant, the focus shifts to the captors. Who are the captors? Why, what's behind that capture that often was a powerful private and was unduly influencing and corrupting the state institutions, in many cases in collusion with politicians and with state actors. And they become the shapers versus the takers of the rules of the game. And that we related to in our work. We saw that it was very much related to the inequality of political influence. And who were the most influential political? How weak was civil society in countering these versus some powerful political actors and so on. Importantly, as distinct from traditional notions of corruption, we saw that it could be done legally. Why it could be done legally? Because the laws themselves had been captured by the captors and adapted to their own needs and to their own good. So the whole issue of only focusing on what's illegal was insufficient in our view. And finally, for provocation, we said, well, maybe we need to redefine the traditional notion of corruption, which was always seen as an abuse of public office for private gain, and instead to suggest the privatization of rulemaking or the privatization of policy making and of polity for their own good. Basically, it was not to totally replace the existing traditional definition, but to suggest that there was a higher form that needed a lot of focus. At the time, we started doing surveys first in economies in transition, the post-Soviet economies, and we saw very interestingly, again, enormous variance. Some countries that were subject to enormous capture, and that was basically how the undue influence and purchases of the presidential decrees, of regulations, of central bank decisions, and so on, in countries like Azerbaijan and Russia, very much in contrast with some countries in the Baltics in general. Here we see Estonia, and interestingly enough, Hungary at the time came out with very low levels of state capture. No longer, that's another story, we will get to that in a second, but it shows how much things can change. So to end, let me show you, and this is very, very recent, something what we've been doing in terms of measuring the extent of state capture around the world with an approach similar to worldwide governance indicators. I showed earlier the 6 indicators, but there was no state capture there. So separately, we tried to do that very recently. And again, we see a very similar type of picture that I showed before for control of corruption. But let's make no mistake, the ordering of the countries, it's the same countries, but the ordering is quite different. So if we look at some advanced economies, in the light blue is extent of state capture. In the black is the extent of corruption. Now higher means worse, okay? So there are countries like the UK, and especially US, and my own country, Chile, where corruption exists, but it's not that high. But state capture is much, much higher. So something is not being measured by the traditional measures of corruption as we see here. By contrast, in Slovakia and in Greece, is the other way around. So it begins to suggest the importance of also trying to measure these. This is for East Asia, so you may be particularly interested. For instance, an emblematic case is Hong Kong, very low relatively, the traditional type of corruption, but by now it's captured, right? And you'll be interested in the Philippines. Both are quite high. State capture a little bit higher, but I wouldn't make too much out of it. But Thailand, much higher state capture than others. You would have comments about Taiwan. Also, it's an interesting case. Singapore, it's also of interest in that. So it provides a somewhat different perspective and begins to suggest that it's important to look at. Finally, to show how this evolves over time, because what we have done here is to trace it since the mid-90s until now. This is just 3 countries, and it's to show what I was suggesting before, how the US has evolved and not necessarily in good direction, in contrast with Uruguay. And Chile, my country, has remained with a non-trivial amount of capture for a while. Of course, none of these 3, we're talking about between the 15 and 30 score in a scale of 0 to 100. None of these compare when we get to the other side of the world, and we see where Russia and how it has been increasing, in contrast with Ukraine in blue, and Turkey and Hungary and Russia, they have all been increasing in terms of state capture. Finally, in terms of the evolution for East Asian countries, Thailand, as we saw before, but we have seen quite a jump in days. Philippines, you can see it's relatively high, and the Koreas, South Korea is at the lower level of that. So again, that's letting the data speak, and it's for commentators and experts here to suggest whether first there's some validity in these, that makes sense to you, and second, what interpretations and possibilities that come out of that. Let me conclude with a few reflections then on this journey, on this type of work. So we saw governance matters, and enormously at that. And it's for many areas that I didn't show the evidence for the lack of time, but for peace, for security, for democracy, for justice, equality, innovation, and obviously anti-corruption. So now we saw the notion of they can't fight corruption by fighting corruption. One has to look at other issues. So voice and democratic accountability is critical. Transparency, which is a huge challenge in many countries. Some decrees, laws are adopted, but are they being implemented? Public finance is critical. What kind of tax reform and how benefits are then being allocated? Public sector reform, including civil service reform, political finance, there are absolutely critical issues that need to be addressed there to address corruption, and not by another campaign or another law against corruption. All countries have laws against corruption, including the worst performing. These combined, and they are unbiased of course, combined with the power of data and of rigorous analysis, can make a difference, and can make a difference also in making the case for policy changes. And we saw then that it's very important, in our view, to move beyond the traditional notions, and particularly on corruption, to move and take very seriously, even though it is a sensitive issue for obvious reasons, very seriously, and try to measure, analyze state capture as a major a challenge. State capture takes place also in natural resources, in oil, among oil interests or an oil sector, hydrocarbons all over the world. That has been an issue, but increasingly also is a concern on the mining side as well. Finally, as a more general comment, just marginal reforms or marginal steps, given the magnitude of the challenge, usually would not suffice. So there is a need for more ambition, and we call it audacity in work that we have done with a colleague which is here present, Mario Picon, on the need basically to make the case for very bold change on many of these, to address these areas of state capture and corruption. But of course, the path for each country will be up to the citizens, to the experts of the leaders of the countries that are there. So it's not from somebody from the outside to elaborate. So let me stop here with many thanks for your patience with this.
No, it's okay. We have two reactors or discussants to lead us into what we hope will be some time for your questions and an open forum later on. I'll introduce both of them right now, but we will start with Dr. Raul Fabella. Dr. Fabella is a social scientist, of course, an economist, Emeritus Professor of the University of the Philippines School of Economics. He holds the position of Honorary Professor at the Asian Institute of Management. He obtained his MA in Economics from UP and his PhD from Yale. He's a member of the National Academy of Science and Technology and was elevated to the rank of National Scientist. In the interest of time, because this will take about 10 minutes to read all the credentials of Dr. Fabella, I'll just end with this as, again, my reminder. My former boss at Business World, Dr. Raul Fabella, and then after him, we will have Ms. Heidi Mendoza, who will be joining us via Zoom. Ms. Heidi is the Dean, College of Management and Accountancy at the FINMA Rizal College of Laguna. She is also a professor cum praxis at Neo de Manila University School of Governance. She was Undersecretary General for the Office of Internal Oversight Services at the United Nations, and most famously here in the Philippines, former commissioner with the Commission on Audit. She's had more than 20 years of service in government, particularly in the field of audits, investigation, fraud examination, anti-corruption, integrity, procurement advocacy. She was a recipient of various awards, including the Pro Deo et Patria recognition from Ateneo de Zamboanga and Yahoo Philippines 7 Modern Filipino Heroes in 2011. She is, of course, a certified public accountant, one of 8 auditor generals in the world, recognized the Art of Audit, published in Amsterdam's Marxist Who's Who in the World of Audit in 2026. And an honorary member of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. Ms. Mendoza is well respected, of course, and you will be hearing from her after we speak and we hear from Dr. Raul Fabella.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Who hasn't cited the authors Gray and Kaufmann? I have. And those of you who are going into the profession will at some point in your life cite Gray and Kaufmann. That's how ubiquitous they are. I was just surprised that Kaufmann is from Chile and not from Israel. But in any case, I'd first like to say that I'm extremely grateful to the researchers and organizations who produce these indices, what's known as governance indices, and make these indices available, largely for free. You can just open your computer and you get the data. I'm sure, Robbie, that this has done much more good than the opposite. These are global public goods that deserve essentially, can you see? That deserve support from everyone, but especially from global taxes, if there were such at the moment, probably not. So I'll focus first on the Philippines rather than on the region because that's what I know. The picture given by Daniel on the Philippines is one of mediocrity. It's mediocre in every way. And every index, it's lower 50%. So that reflects in our economic performance. Over the long period, not over the last year or the last 2 years, but over the long term, 50 years, it's really mediocre. It is essentially a trip from among the top-ranked countries in this region to the bottom. You may have seen the picture of how the Philippines has traversed over the years the per capita GDP comparisons in this region. Because if you are comparing the Philippines with other regions, our mediocrity is actually normal. The problem is that we are living in a region which is tremendously high performance, and therefore, by that standard, mediocrity is the word that applies. So, control of corruption, lower 25 to 50%. There's no change since 2000. We are in that category like Thailand and Indonesia. But Thailand and Indonesia has left that behind in terms of performance. So we have to look for boosters, some other places. Voice and accountability, again, lower 45%, and going down. I think it was highest under Aquino, and now has precipitously gone down. Luckily, and I'm happy about this, De Lima was given temporary free time, as it were. She could still be brought back. Political stability and absence of violence, well, again, very low. Lower 30% in government effectiveness, regulatory rule of law, control of corruption, always very low. Well, it reflects, by the way, our PISA, PISA ratings, and so many other international ratings. But, in fact, Eurodata says that we are middling. Those international indices says that we are the pits, essentially. Next, please. I personally thank Danielle for trying very hard to explain the wherewithal of the indices, because of course there are people who will say that the indices are a conspiracy to make all of us weird. Weird in the sense of Joseph Henry, which is Western, affluent, etc. But it's not a very praiseworthy state to be. So I know that Danielle tried very hard to explain that. But I'd really like to see index by index who are the people who were consulted, who are the organizations, these questionnaires that they were sent to them. And of course you have all sorts of ways to validate the data, I'm sure. I'd very much like to know these validations. Okay, let's go ahead. I'll be selective, by the way. The data here deserves volumes of commentary. I cannot supply that. Focus on the Philippines, again, mediocrity numbers. Go ahead, please. Go ahead, EBSCO. Next, please. There are 6 governance indices, and now it's going to be 7. Not all indices are created equal. I personally trust the rule of law index more than any other indices, because the rule of law index is closer affinity to economic performance than any other index like voice and accountability, for example. Voice and accountability and control of corruption are very related, correlated. And this should translate into higher growth per capita for countries, but I think the evidence is very mixed with voice and accountability. Corruption, of course, is bad for growth, but as I've said, the evidence is mixed. I personally trust rule of law, but not every rule of law index is the same is equal. I trust the rule of law index in its very narrow sense, and that is I think, what Acemoglu and Robinson had in mind when they wrote Why Nations Fail. That is the rule of law, as interpreted narrowly, being respect for property rights and enforcement of contracts. There is a rule of law, a broader rule of law definition, which includes freedoms and human rights. That is the impact on economic performance is a little bit more dispersed as well, as it were. So I am an advocate of rule of law, but it's really the narrow rule of law definition. Next, please. Poverty and governance. The poverty here is $250 a day, PPP. How does governance matter here? Again, let me dwell on the exception. Exception is, of course, China. China, well, achieved most likely to be unparalleled, historically unparalleled, achieved a success in poverty reduction in the last 30 years. China contributed plenty to world poverty in 1990, but now it's almost nothing. You can imagine, you can see that people will be fascinated by what's happening here. China's governance indices are bad, except for government effectiveness. So, for example, voice and accountability is almost nothing. Very low. No more than among the top 40% in regulatory quality. Rule of law and control of corruption. Only government effectiveness is some kind of a performer. But among the top performers in economic growth and poverty reduction. And this is what people pay attention to. That is what I pay attention to. Economic growth and poverty reduction. Of course, if I stop there, I will say new conservative. No? I care for human rights, but I care more for poverty reduction. Next, please. Global competitiveness and corruption. global competitiveness and corruption is really rather high correlation in the sample of East Asia. That's to be expected. The storyline, of course, is that openness and industrial structure is correlated very highly. Less open economies are also economies that have greater share of GDP in services and less share of manufacturing and services, meaning to say the industrial structure that is connected with the rest of the world, which is manufacturing. Those are generally, they tend to be more protected, and therefore these protection are the large source of traditional corruption. I'll talk about non-traditional corruption later, but these are sources of traditional corruption. Next, please. So now I will say a little bit about state corruption, state capture. State capture here is really state capture by private players and its impact on economic performance. I don't understand how state capture, how China could be in the 25 to 50% percentile and in state capture. Because the hegemony of the Communist Party of China is pervasive. They just shut down the founder and head of their Alibaba, Jack Ma. And every Chinese entrepreneur is quaking in their boots. If Xi Jinping turns their way. So I don't know, that's let me say something else. Again, probably an exception. The Gilded Age in the United States was from about 1879 to 1900. That was the time when the United States overtook Europe in terms of industrialization. It was an extremely rapidly interesting era. But it was also the era of the robber barons. You heard of the robber barons? The Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the JP Morgans. Essentially, people who hijacked the US legislatures to bend laws in their direction. So, again, this is a very interesting exception. Of course, exceptions always exist in statistics. But the fact of the matter is, we have sometimes to reckon with exceptions. Because if they are so important, we just have to reckon with them. This is slightly contentious empirics between democracy and economics and economic performance. Barro and Salai Martin in 1998 showed that economic liberalization has a positive impact on economic growth. Political liberalization, however, does not. May in fact be either zero and or negative. So the hypothesis is that state capture versus economic growth and poverty reduction, there's just, I think, no definitive effect. But I have a positive spin for state capture. Next. In the early stages of development, the state itself may be the greatest source of instability. And therefore, the greatest hindrance to economic performance. Market players would like stability and rules, but they're not going to get it by hoping that the politicians will have a Saul of Tarsus event. They will have an epiphany. They will suddenly do it. Market players may have to dip their feet in the ocean of politics. That's what I call defensive state capture. The private interests capturing state organs, not who lace their own pockets, but in order to prevent predation from the state itself. Okay, I have 2 minutes. I feel that hegemony by economic empire builders is better than hegemony by political empire builders. But economic empire builders are closer to what Mansur Olson called stationary bandits. Political empire builders are closer to what Olson called roving bandits. And the thesis has the same conclusion. Next, please. I have said it already, so let's go ahead. Next, please. There are varieties of state capture by type of captors, for example, by economic empire builders, robber barons, tribals, karates, and saibatsus may actually work for the country. Political empire builders, Turkey and Marcos, may actually work against general welfare. By the exercise and capture of power, members of the economic family themselves may become legislators. Clearly, the Lopez's in sugar in the 1970s, that was clear. And of course now the Villars. The Villars, the real estate empire. Indirect capture, you just bankroll politicians in the legislature. Very clear in the case of Lucio Tan and the cigarette empire. Next, please. On the whole, I am deeply grateful, as I've mentioned earlier, to the organizations and researchers who produce and make available these governance indices, which catalyze debates and discourses on the trajectory of governance. So on the whole, muchísimas gracias. Thank you.
And now joining us via Zoom, Ms. Heidi Mendoza.
Hi, good afternoon, or should I say good evening? Good evening, okay? So, to put everyone at ease, and perhaps to give everyone a flavor of what I'm going to say, I ask you to check your Facebook.
Are you here? Ms. Mendoza?
I'm actually talking. I'm talking now.
Is that her?
Hello?
No, I think,
Hello?
let me just check. Ms. Mendoza, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, would you like, what's gonna happen? Okay, so Ms. Mendoza will just be a reactor. There's no presentation. Are we turning on her camera? Hindi lang pa. Could you speak up po? Isubukan lang po natin yung microphone nyo. Ma'am? Pasensya na po, we're trying to fix it on our end, but could you test your microphone po just so we could be sure that we can hear you? Okay. Ms. Mendoza?
Hello?
Ayan, okay. We can hear you po. May presentation po ba kayo?
Hello?
Hello, ma'am? Ms. Mendoza, can you hear us?
Hello?
I think nakamute tayo. Sorry, Ms. Mendoza, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, okay. We can't see you. Are you turning on your camera or audio lang po tayo?
When I try
Okay.
to
Eto
turn
na po.
in
We can
my
see
camera,
you.
I'm having a very...
We can see you, we can hear you. So, Ms. Heidi Mendoza, maraming salamat po.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to, of course, our guest, Daniel Kaufmann. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists, Dr. Raul Papelia, and of course, the MC for this afternoon. Okay, perhaps to introduce a flavor of what I'm going to say, I ask every one of you to open your Facebook account and look at my post. So I have there, excited to be Daniel's guest. Yun lang, Daniel Kaufmann of State Capture and Corruption. Katulad ng case niya, sana chapter closed na rin tayo sa corruption. Sorry naman, hindi tayo makamove on. Well, the main thought is, do not fight corruption with corruption. Yan din ang advice ko kay Catherine Blythe, do not fight. Yun lang. Okay, so why am I starting with this a little bit off topic, should we say? Because that's exactly where the country is. And if you're going to ask me about fighting corruption, I do agree that we do not fight corruption by fighting corruption. And I agree with Daniel Kaufmann that there are still many issues that we need to fight into. But I'd like to reflect on the practical aspects of fighting corruption. To be honest, I could never believe that at the age of 61, I would still be doing the same, okay? I had both positive and negative experiences. And I would say, perhaps you win some, you lose some in terms of fighting corruption. Perhaps we can discuss first on the difficulties and the challenges. I know you're no stranger to what happened in 2011 when I and the entire family had to undergo the so-called witness protection program, but without the support, not really without the support, without utilizing or without leaning on the witness protection program support. Because I do believe that the government has limited resources, and if I lean onto it, I feel like I may have readily, I may not be in a position to do that at that moment. So what I'm trying to say here is that in fighting corruption, we have to look at the cultural context of it. So many people are asking me, what has changed in terms of fighting corruption? And I would say, well, it's the same. It's the same, basically. The only thing that differed, perhaps, are the players, diba? And if I have to examine, perhaps, or assess who are the players right now, well, siguro, a bit different from the ones we have in the past, wherein most of them under the so-called administrative or bureaucratic corruption, wherein most of those involved in corruption are the ones involved in government or in those petty bureaucratic services, right? Now we have political players, diba? We have those who are outside of the government, but the ones, as David Kaufmann has mentioned or described, the ones shaping the policy or influencing even the policymakers. I'd like perhaps to concentrate on certain insights on the basis of my experience. Fighting corruption is difficult, especially if you do not have the people inside government fully understanding and embracing the need to fight corruption. When I say, why do we need to embrace that we need to fight corruption, and let's make it personal? Because if I take a look at what happened in the past, if ever I had that a very rare chance of being successful in fighting corruption, let me perhaps seg a bit and state some particular instances. When I was the Undersecretary General of the UNOIOS, we were successful in filing a case against the President of the General Assembly. We were even successful in perhaps in getting the proceeds of the corruption. We were even successful in prosecuting those who are involved. When I filed the case against the military controller, I think to a certain extent we were successful. With the help of the U.S. government, of course, we were able to recover the proceeds of the corrupt acts. Like, for example, the Trump Tower. The sale of the Trump Tower was turned over to the government, I think sometime in 2016. So I would say that, yes, there are still some positive results out of fighting corruption. But if I reflect and take a look at it, that fight has been very personal. It has been very personal because fighting corruption is indeed personal. It is personal because if it is not personal, you will not succeed fighting it. You will not succeed fighting it because the challenges the challenges that one has to go through is really, daunting. It involves life. It involves career, right? And therefore, to fight corruption is a personal commitment. And having said so, how do we then blend the lecture that we've just heard from Dr. Kaufmann and the message that I've been driving? Let's take a look at where the country is. I've been looking at institutions. And I think you will agree with me if I say that several of integrity institutions and critical institutions in fighting corruption have been compromised. And perhaps that could even be an understatement. And because of this, it is very difficult for the ordinary citizen to embrace we need to fight corruption. For one, I have been so disappointed because although I try to be very vocal in terms of putting a very, very clear and transparent stand in terms of where I am, in terms of public issues, and where the public should be, the problem is when you are asked by the citizens, Ma'am, where can we report these corrupt acts? And then I started feeling, what will I tell them? Should I tell them go to the ombudsman? Should I tell them go to the Commission on Audit? Should I tell them follow the existing structures and processes? When in fact, I myself am doubtful if such process and structures work. Second, should I be telling them, yes, fight corruption, yes, report this, yes, follow the steps and procedures, but at the same time, at the end of that advice, I will have to caution them, please take good care. Please take extra precaution because I know you are risking your life. Because it is my own experience. I always share this experience where we have a whistleblower. I was then the commissioner. We went to my office. We were successful in filing case against the mayor. In fact, he was removed from the office. But then counter charges were filed against the whistleblower. We were able to help her in the Civil Service Commission. But came the feast of Christ the King, and she was shot dead in front of the church. And from then on, I had second thoughts of asking or even telling anyone who would ask me, Ma'am, what can I do? Where will I report? Because somehow I felt the pain and the guilt of asking someone or perhaps pushing someone to make something in order to make that fight real. We have lots of facts, we have lots of evidence, and I think that both scientific and other extra, I would say, cultural means have been adopted or have been tried, and yet we are in the same situation. We are in the same situation when I was still young and still single, and very, very passionate in terms of fighting corruption. While we know that voice and accountability is a critical factor, and I would say that at least that is something that I have to be thankful. The continuous debate in terms of the social media, of course, is doing a lot. However, we have to be careful as well in the spread of disinformation. Last December, I think, I was given a chance to talk before Asian Development Bank visitors in one of their, I think this is during the celebration of the Anti-Corruption Day. And they were so surprised because my topic is about fighting corruption and disinformation. I informed them about how a simple audit opinion can be weaponized in terms of making it appear that there is no corruption. Let me state it in a very simple and I hope very clear manner. When you say you are given a clean audit opinion, it means that you have followed the standards and the presentation, and then of course it is fairly presented, the financial statements. However, I was surprised to find out several local government claiming the very fact that we receive an audit opinion, it means that we are free from fraud and corruption. And I was just saying, how come? I think this is the only country where even the audit opinion is being the subject of disinformation. That's why I say we have to know very well what corruption is, what we are fighting with, because even if corruption seems to be an ordinary word for everyone, for every Filipino, there seems to be still some misinformation about it. Second, I'm so sad with the losses or as a result of corruption, not on the economic side, but on the moral side. Last election, it's very clear in terms of choices, right? But look where we are. Diba? And then this culture of smart shaming, how can you encourage whistleblower to come out? When, if you say something about something that is not right, and then people will say, "Oh, ikaw na ang magaling," di ba? This is the so-called smart shaming, which foreigners are not so aware of. So, I began to study about the little ways, actually, cultural practices, or perhaps ordinary way of doing things, ordinary part of our everyday living that somehow contributes to the so-called corruption. The only thing that I would say I'm a little bit excited is the way public issues are being debated in social media. And if only for that purpose, I am willing to reach out to those who has not learned as the people in this room. They may not have a doctorate degree. They may not be graduates of University of the Philippines, but their decision matters. They're the ones that we need to reach out to. And as long as they are more concerned with the breakup of Catherine Bernardo and Daniel Padilla, we have a long way to go. We have to make the issue of corruption an everyday issue. To give you a very specific point, we were auditors then. We were inspecting, I think we were trying to interview and validate the distribution of fertilizers among coconut farmers, no? And when I asked them, where did you use the fertilizer, ma'am, sir? We feed it po to the pigs. And I said, don't you know that we borrowed a lot? There's a huge loan that we have obtained to be able to pay it. And then casually, ang sagot, Tagalog. Alay, mabuti naman po. At ako'y walang pumupunta din sa bahay para ako'y singilin. And that is it. Unless we make the consequences and impact of corruption so simple that they can be understood by ordinary man on the street. Yung tipong mai-relate nila doon sa pumupunta sa tiyan nila, we will have a long way to go. 61 na po ako. I was successful in prosecuting, a former controller, successful perhaps in prosecuting a governor of the autonomous region for Muslim Mindanao, successful in filing case against the President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, but still not successful in terms of my personal fight against corruption. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Follow my Facebook account para po mag-copyright tayo, and in the hope na itong issue ng katiwalian ay magiging sikat katulad ng breakup ni Daniel at ni Catherine. Maraming salamat at magandang hapon.
Maraming salamat po. Ms. Mendoza, of course, is still with us. And may we invite Professor Kaufmann, Dr. Fabella to come here to the front. We still have a few minutes. Officially, we can, of course, go a little bit over time. I imagine a lot of people have a lot of questions, but Mr. Kaufmann and Mr. Fabella, please join us on stage. Quick survey of the room. Who has questions? Okay, one over there. Oh, sige. Oh, sige, alternate ko to my left, to my right, to my left, to my right, over there. If you could state your name. Yes. Do we have a microphone at the back? We have microphones down the aisle. Pakiabot na lang.
Good afternoon, professors. Thank you for your talk. My name is Joseph Buluntiam. I am a fourth-year BS Econ student from the School of Economics. I wanted to ask more about the government indicators, since I think it's incredibly relevant in your analysis of development and the trajectory of countries. So I wanted to ask, how do long-term and external imperialist forces affect or are corrected for in the index of political stability and any other relevant indicators? Probably voice and accountability would be the next most affected. An example of this would be Palestine under siege by Israeli forces over a decades-long imperialist oppression, leading to the creation of radical groups, which then would probably be captured by the indices. I wanted to ask this additional question, if you would like to ponder upon it as well, and if it would be captured by state capture. So, for example, chummy relations between the U.S., China, Duterte, and Marcos, and how they influence our economic policy.
Okay.
Thank you.
Professor Kaufmann?
Thank you. Very good. Is this on? Very good question. And I want to relate it first for quick background to one of the many very good points that Professor Fabella made, and it relates of where does this data come from, okay? Which is very relevant. And by the way, I may not have mentioned not only all the methodological data, but every individual data source of that is all part of the documentation, totally transparent and online. So you can look up every variable, and in fact, there may be some for your studies or for your review, doing something in a country that you may find more relevant than other. What I showed here, for the sake of time, is the aggregated indicators in each case, but there are hundreds of disaggregated ones, and all the data is there. Now, the data comes from 30 different sources, and I show them too quickly. It's on a slide that I will share, but it's a combination, contrary to popular notions in the early days of the governance indicators, of the North, the South, the East, and the West. So the Afro-barometer, the Asia barometers, the Latin American barometers, which are all very regional, are all there, the citizens from those countries responding. The Gallup polls are global, but they ask the questions to each national citizen. So the citizens themselves are providing their views. The same with the enterprise service. Even the expert, the data that comes from expert assessment, Economics Intelligence Unit and so on, true, they're based in London, their headquarters. However, they're experts in each case. They have the experts in the countries. We also did, to your question, we did validity tests of potential biases, ideological biases, because there are some outfits that may be more right of center, other left of center, and so on. And we had a variable, which is the political leaning and so on, and we did tests, and there was none that was statistically significant of those that we use. Now, the focus is on governance indicators and data at the national level. We do not capture directly the transnational dimension. So just like when they ask me, well, do you have what happens with education, what happens with income, what happens with socioeconomic issues, what happens with transnational issues. Those are the issues, like the one you raised, for research saying, okay, here's the data, let me relate it and see whether those countries that have been subject to external influences, positive or very negative, like you may have suggested, they do matter. So one of the beliefs that we have had all the time is that the indicators are what they are, but then it's for the students, for the scholars, for the academics to use it, to relate it to many phenomena that are consequences or are factors determining these indicators. But we do not pretend to try to encompass every determinant or every consequence. That's more part of the research. Now, it is reasonable to speculate, but we have not that analysis, that countries that have been subject to very adverse external influence, and you mentioned one, I would also mention Russia and Ukraine, right? For instance, and there are many others, you would find that obviously that adverse influence has had an impact on the governance indicators of that particular nation, but we don't pass a judgment of what is. Now, some countries with a particular colonial history may have ended up with better or worse indicators too. Those are for the researchers to do. Similarly, those countries that are engaging in transnational poor governance influencing typically are not doing very well on their own domestic indicators. And so you will not find, you will not find that those very adverse external influences are coming from the Denmarks of this world. And that. So there is also an appropriate sense that the national indicators, just like they're doing very well nationally, they're probably not engaging in extremely negative practice. But essentially what you have asked is, it may be a good thesis research for you to do, because we do not pretend to capture all that.
Mm. A question here, somebody raised, okay, we're there.
Hello, good evening. My name is Angel Torres, and my question is, in relation to your discussion of state capture, rent-seeking has been one of the primary methods of those in the private and public sector to utilize the mechanisms justly provided by the law to perpetuate corruption. Do you think that that the guarantees of protection of freedoms and rights under the law, such as freedom of expression, press freedom, and activism, criticizing such activities, are enough to counter these corrupt activities? And moreover, do you think the state exercising a higher degree of police power in regulating and/or prohibiting such activities be more effective in controlling and lessening corruption, while the fact remains that the state actors themselves, the captors, are the ones capitalizing on these rent-seeking activities?
That was very eloquent. I'm not sure how much it was a question or a comment. But I guess I agree with you, the premise in your question. Obviously, repressive type of moves in terms of voice and accountability and rule of law. And by the way, they are also in the excellent remarks by the two reactors commentators. Professor Fabelia was talking about your preference for rule of law. I would interpret your preference for rule of law as a broad preference, because human rights also was mentioned. So we get also into voice and democratic accountability. The second part of your comment question to you, basically, you were putting a scenario of an adverse travel, the direction of travel in terms of basic freedoms, voice, democratic accountability, and basic rights. That, and there, we should talk much more, Professor, later. I'm totally aware of the Barrow and many of his collaborators' studies, but that's already 25 years ago. In fact, Acemoglu himself and others have studied that refute the ambiguity in the relationship between having more voice and accountability and much better socioeconomic results. So it has been a very controversial issue, but more recent research, I would submit, does suggest that it's incredibly important. Now, I think it was also implicit in your question to ask whether these basic freedoms you're talking about are enough to address all these governance problems, corruption, and state capture. And the answer is not. They are absolutely necessary, but they're not sufficient. And that's why this is so complex. And one needs basically to work across disciplines. The activists and smart people and heroes like Heidi Mendoza. That's one approach, and it's absolutely crucial. That has to be complemented by people working on rule of law, on other rule of law aspects, working on civil service reform, on the tax reforms that are pending, and also there are basic issues of transparency. You mentioned also, right, all those rights. First of all, you mentioned the legal, more formal aspects, if they are adopted and so on, but then they're adopted but not implemented. So the implementation on the ground of these statutes, these laws and regulations, in many countries the most important challenge. In fact, Philippines, I would guess, has many of these in the books. Are they properly implemented? That's the question. And for that, it requires an interdisciplinary approach where many of these areas have to be tackled. One alone will not suffice.
Any questions here? Okay.
Hello, I'm Enzo. I'm a third-year BS Economics student at School of Economics. My question for both professors is, in your lecture, you mentioned numerous instances where improving governance and lessening corruption create more favorable economic outcomes, i.e. the 3 times development dividend, more competitive sovereign bonds, and smaller budget deficits. From an administrative perspective, are there any specific reforms or best practices off the top of your head that seem to be universal in their efficacy when it comes to fighting corruption and improving governance? If none, are there any factors that make the fight against corruption exponentially more complex?
Professor Fabella? Yeah. Let's also throw the question to Ms. Mendoza.
This is, of course, testable. Countries that are more open are less corrupt. You can test it. You can make it a senior essay. You can use the data available. But countries that are more open are also less corrupt. Countries with firms that have to compete for their take-home with the rest of the world are generally more into innovation and cost efficiency rather than corruption. So, if you want the Philippines to be less corrupt, then see to it that the share of manufacturing, which is a tradable good, in this country is raised from 20% to 30%. And the share of services goes down from 63% to 40%. There you will have a tremendous impact on corruption. It is our thesis, especially with the Foundation for Economic Freedom, that it is economic protection that is the source of a lot of corruption. So if you want to fight corruption, change the industrial structure. That's not very easy, of course. That's not very easy. But you have to change the incentive structure in order to change the industrial structure of the country. I don't want to say anything more.
Yeah. Let me just quickly call on Ms. Mendoza if she has any thoughts on this. What has worked? Is Ms. Mendoza still with us? Wala na. Okay. Sige. I have a question on that. I don't think anybody will argue against better governance. I don't think anybody will argue against the causalities and the relationships that we've highlighted about improved governance, less corruption, improvement in both leads to better performance, right? But then you go to the root of the very first statement, improved governance. And that's my question, because that's where the human element always comes in. We were trying to reconcile state capture and extent of corruption. And in the Philippines, I think it's safe to say, the captors are the captured as well. There is no distinction between political power and the private sector. You go to the local governments and to every community, it is oligopolies, right? Where the biggest businesses and the most vital industries are in fact controlled by our congressmen and in many cases our senators, all the way to the highest levels of government. So my question is, what has worked at the individual level, at the human level, short of the epiphany that Dr. Fabella says, let's not wait for that epiphany, right? Among enlightened, maybe second, third generation politicians. What has worked in terms of incentives and disincentives for the political powers and the political dynasties in this country? To actually say, you know, it's not an epiphany. It actually still serves my self-interest to go for more progressive policies.
My own feeling is, maybe short of the desired answer, is that a lot of the corruption is precipitated by government rules. Take, for example, in agriculture. What is keeping agriculture so anemic in this country? The rules of land reform is extremely binding. You cannot own more than 5 hectares. You cannot truck and barter land unless you have a permission. And if you are a very productive farmer with a lot of human capital, you cannot buy the next guy's land. You want to cultivate 25 hectares rather than 5 hectares. You have to go to the government for permission. If land reform, not land reform, the CARP is not there, that is done by the market. But if you have to go to the land reform office to get signatures and all that, then you're subject. You have to come across under the table. So rules precipitate corruption. And if you simply lift some of these rules, there's no basis for corruption. It disappears.
Yeah, but I mean, Dr. Kaufmann, those rules are in fact being written or sat on or delayed or ignored by the same people that we would like to appeal to. I mean, is it a matter of us not communicating progressive enough policies? Is it a matter of us not being very clear that, look, you have the Head Start, it is an incentive for your family to still be rich, at the same time to have a political legacy of having opened this up to the rest of the country?
Thank you. Okay. I thought somebody was going to complain about the comment or the question. Let me be very, very frank, because these have been extremely eloquent feedback, comments, and your question. What about, is there a chance for boldness, audacity, and having 500 Heidis? Okay, we just heard Heidi. Okay, so where are all the others? In other countries, over time, that has made the difference. And she mentioned the fantastic successes and inspiring at the UN, and of course in taking up the highest level. So yes, it can be done. So that's the first question, but I throw it back at you. And why can that be formed around coalitions? And I know that there are quite a few here, which I happen to know, are also ready and are working on this stuff. Why aren't they much more? Why could they get much better organized? Because Heidi is fantastic, but one person cannot make the difference. So there has to be collective action. And I know that they are very progressive section also of the private sector, as you said, and you mentioned also the good guys, and then there are the others, and they are reformers even within government at any point, with any regime. That always happens. And then movements can make a huge difference. There comes a time, and in terms of state capture, when the people get together and say enough is enough. It happened in 2018. Look up 2018 Chile. And the uprising, and 1.5 million people in a country of 18 million, in Santiago alone, in the central plaza. And essentially that led to major changes, and now a left of central government is there. They're struggling, it's very young, not experience is an issue, and so on. But it's a different picture. They are addressing these issues of capture. Now let me say very quickly something about state capture, because you brought up such an insightful and important point. I didn't have the time to elaborate. So, look, when we started the work on state capture, this is 1998, 1999, 2000, with Joel Hellman, we focused on one type of captor, the non-state actor, the private actor, the oligarchs in Russia, okay, and Ukraine, and their ability to shape the new states and the country. Over time, the whole notion, and we measured and so on, but it was taken up by very smart political scientists, and they expanded the notion to also politicians and state leaders doing the capture. So the way I call it is a distinction between capture of the state by the private as opposed to capture by the state of some of the oligarchs. Now, in practice, many countries are in the gray zone where they collude, and that's what you're talking about. It's a collusion between the two. So there's a whole spectrum, and this is we can be here until midnight discussing this issue and this whole spectrum. Now, you presented a hypothesis or your hunch that the capture by the state is much more pernicious to a country than by the state leaders and politicians than the capture of the state by the privates. I would submit to you and to everybody else that's a testable proposition. The data is out there. I don't have a prior but against it. But I would also suggest, I hope somebody can do this research, that if you don't take seriously enough the capture of the state by the privates, then you may be missing a dynamic which is crucial. The countries, the democratic, fragile democracies that become increasingly captured by the oligarchs risk ending up being autocracies. This is the story of Russia and how Putin comes in and fights the oligarchs. So at first it was capture basically of the state by the oligarchs. Today is exactly the opposite. So I would submit that it's very important to look at the whole spectrum and to study maybe there's a dynamic that is still a very significant risk, even if you consider it less than capture. But if you are increasingly being captured, all the states that captured by the oligarchs, you may end up the people saying, we'd rather have than a dictatorship, because this basically affects, threatens all the basic democratic institutions.
Yeah.
Up until very recently, maybe about 200 years ago, voting franchise was the right of landowners. Even in England, in the 17th century, you can vote only if you're a landowner. Now, is that a capture of the state by the private groups? But you know, there are two domains. One domain is politics, where it's one man, one vote. The other domain is business, where it's one share, one vote. Okay. Now, as far as incentives and economics is concerned, the second, to me, is better. Because people who will run the corporations are the people who have a stake in the success or failure of the company. And that is why I consider the fact that perhaps one share, one vote should also be tried, apart from one man, one vote. Because the economics, incentives, incompatibility requirement is actually met by one share, one vote. Not by one man, one vote. It's one share, one vote. Yes. It's one share, one vote.
Yeah. Don't we run the risk of, given how badly many things have not been run in the Philippines, for example, and therefore how badly people now fare, right? Where the poor are not only isolated and marginalized, they are frankly uneducated, undereducated, and therefore no access to credit, and so on down the line until they grow up and they're essentially the same person that their parents were when they were born. Doesn't that run the risk of disenfranchising the victims?
No, just to suggest that and we have seen it in Latin America, that, and of course we need to test it now with this new data, we can do more research. So it's in the speculative side without having done all the rigorous empirics. But I would suggest that the more a country is traveling towards capture, to state capture, the more the vested interests, the incentives are for the elite that the lower classes remain uneducated. Because that's part of the capture. It's capture also of the education system. So the elite will make sure that the private and the best universities continue to be perfectly funded and so on, but also in terms of the more basic schooling level and so on. So we see associated with, first, inequality of political influence, we see that that leads to more state capture, right? Because the few that have this excessive type of influence manage to capture. And associated with this state capture, there is more inequality in the education system. So it's not that it stays backwards for all, but the elite still benefits. The elite sends the kids abroad, right? But not.
Yes? Yes, one more question.
I think this will be the last question. So during this lecture, we've been diagnosing countries in relation to corruption, as well as prescribing what solutions or practices work best to combat it. And then, as said by the speakers earlier, some countries are politically and economically hegemonic, but citizens are enjoying their just shares in the country's economic production. And at the same time, some countries enjoy the highest level of democracy and liberality in many aspects of their cultural and social life, basically their life, with regard to human rights, of course. But economic stability is out of reach in these countries. So my question really is, and what makes me wonder, is what is really the ultimate end goal of good governance?
Not government functionaries or officials. Government politicians, for example, their end goal is to get elected in the next election. So, if each is to choose between a bridge and a basketball court, a basketball court takes 3 months to complete. A bridge takes 3 years, or 4 years, or perhaps 6 beyond his tenure. How will he choose? How will you choose if you were trying to win the next election? Basketball court, of course. That's incentives compatible. You will not try to build a bridge that will be inaugurated by the next governor. It's a basketball court. So then you are trapped in the idea that whatever is short run and will be completed before the election, I'll go for that.
Yeah. Kaya kung may magtanong sa inyo, why it took 40 years for us to recapture the championship? You can tell them, because we had our priorities straight. Investments in our future first. Then we will invest in basketball.
Just at the very basic level, what about embracing the notion of sustained and equitable socioeconomic development and well-being for all citizens? Okay, to start with that, now we have shown, and the data is out there, that good governance is absolutely crucial for that. So that's another. Now, but that's staying at 30,000 feet. Some of you have asked very good questions, but concretely, we have given some examples. There are many more for another discussion. But let me just put 2 things here. One, and it relates to your point about politicians and voters and so on. What about a campaign for radical transparency? many countries, and my sense is that Philippines is no exception, have done quite a bit in adopting some transparency regulations and requirements. In terms of implementation, it's not there. How many confidential funds, how many issues are there that you could be requesting the information you are entitled to, but you cannot get it? Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative is one example. The performance there is mixed. Within that, how about a major improvement on beneficiary ownership, disclosures and transparency? So you get to know not only about in mining, oil and other interests, but everybody can have full access, and it's a portal of who are really the ultimate beneficiary owners of every enterprise. The same regarding total disclosure of asset and income. Do you have access to all the asset and income declaration, and is it verified for your politicians, for your high officials, for so on? That's best practice in other countries. So then, the brilliant people who are here, you can start triangulating between this data. Okay, now I see all these assets, and then you triangulate with campaign contributions, who receives what and from whom, and then you triangulate it with how they vote. And then you publish it in the media or online. I don't know, you may be persecuted for that. You would know better what happens. But the power of combining transparency, disclosure, accountability, and data and analysis could be extremely, extremely powerful in doing that. And there are very good examples in the Baltic countries and others that have made very significant progress on that. That's very, very practical. And one more practical issue, you would know better. Is there Philippines has adopted, and does it work, plea bargaining? What? Plea bargaining. Does it exist, and is it used?
No, we either destroy the enemy completely or...
Okay. Well, but that what this is the very famous state capture case of Odebrecht in Brazil. Do you remember Lava Jato? How do you say it in Tagalog or in English here? I don't know. But basically, what happened with this major constructor company of the major oil company that was basically paying bribes to all the officials, and not only in Brazil, in Peru, even related to South Korea and other countries. About 5 heads of state in Latin America were involved. Look it up, Lava Jato, between Odebrecht, the company, Marcelo Odebrecht, the company, and Petrobras, the oil company. Now, how does it all come to veil? An enormous amount of information comes out. Is because Brazil had one of the main reasons. There are others. The judiciary had improved. They had changed the old judges that were corrupt. They put new judges. But they also had plea bargaining, meaning that they went to Odebrecht and said, we have some information here. There's something going on. If you tell us and give us all the books, how all this collusion was happening, and you tell us all about it, we'll give you a lighter sentence. That's plea bargaining. The whole case explodes, and the things that were found out. That's one way of fighting. In fact, look it up in the web. They say fantastic mini-series, fictionalized but pretty accurate, called in Portuguese, O Mecanismo, in Spanish, El Mecanismo, which is the mechanism how state capture really works, taken from that case study. But again, is to show that there are innovations, legal innovations, and other very practical things that some could be working on very specifically. Because otherwise, if we stay just with the data that we show, these general comments, we're not going to get anywhere.
It is 6:20, I'll cheat a bit, it's 6:27 in my time, which means we have about 3 minutes. Let's round it out. If you don't mind, just another 3 minutes. I did want to ask something about the data at the very top, right? The top performing and the high indexed nations. I couldn't help but notice these are all very small nations. Scandinavian countries, Singapore as the outlier in Southeast Asia, Uruguay, you pointed out, Latin America, Taiwan, coming back here. all very small. Reminds me of a story, I don't know if it's a joke, I don't know if it's urban legend, but supposedly Xi Jinping was in Singapore and he was asked, what do you think of Singapore? He said, it's very impressive. I think the mayor of Shanghai has a lot to learn. And it just brings me back to, I know, an advocacy of Shelo and a lot of the economists here. That maybe, it's too unwieldy to think of all of these reforms that have to come together, all at the same time, for a country, in our case, of more than 100 million people. And I don't even know how many provinces by now, right? But what are the indicators, if you were to take these indices, if they exist at all, down to city levels? In other words, might we find our inspiration not at the national level? Might we find the innovations and the successful experimentations and the interventions that break all of these complicated cycles? Is it easier to find the inspirations in community to local level governments rather than trying to think of the impossible of one raft of reform that will happen at the national level?
Very, very good question. It's very important, just before we finish, for perspective, just the fact that we happen to be here on the podium doesn't mean we have all the answers, right? And many of these questions, we still have them, and it reminds me of Mark Twain 150 years ago, whatever. You know how he defined an expert? Somebody from out of town at that time. But basically was laughing at this expert just because you come about. So this is what you said. It requires much more research. So I'll just say two basic points. One, there is some evidence that, of course, it's easier to manage and do better if the country is smaller than if it's very large. But there's nothing predetermined. I mean, some of the large European countries, including France and Germany, even the UK now with the hiccup of Brexit, although they have done better than some other large countries. So even within large countries, there's a vast difference. The second point is, how about an initiative, a double initiative, one on the research, another on the activism? One is that any of you take up trying to have a measure per province, governance for each province. In fact, a few years into our worldwide governance indicator, I got contacted by a university in Mexico, Monterrey, and they wanted help for all the states. They wanted to do internally. So that's feasible. It's significant work and requires some resources, but you can do it for that. Now, out of that, a very activist initiative could come about where you implicitly, it goes to your incentives, starts a competition. And it could be even at the city level. We have also worked in the past at the city level in terms of helping to improve governance and corruption, including a huge city like Sao Paulo, which is much larger than Manila, in fact, with mixed success and so on.